I want to thank Tracy Shannon for being with us today. She has what sounds like a painful story to tell. And like many of these stories, I really appreciate your willingness to open up and share your experience so that those of us who are trying to understand what's going on have some insights. Tracy, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your experience?
Sure, and feel free to jump in and ask any of the usual questions that I get whenever I start in. But so my perspective on the whole issue of transgenderism is shaped by my own experiences with that to a large extent, as well as 20 years of learning about all of this movement and what it's looked like and how it's affecting our freedoms in the United States and overseas. So many years ago, I married my college sweetheart and started a family with him. And after 15 years of marriage, he decided he was going to live the rest of his life as a woman. So usually when I say that, I'll get, asked, were there any signs? And I would say there weren't any signs that he wanted to be a woman. Were there some things wrong? Yes, there were definitely some things wrong in the relationship. From very early in the marriage, he started in with some behavior that I could only characterize as cross-dressing, but I wouldn't say it was full-fledged cross-dressing, and it wasn't out in front of me. It was just some hints of that took place. And I would find out, I would find in his luggage from a business trip, my bra, was in there when I went to unpack it for him as a favor. And I'd be like, what was this in here for?
But it was your bra and not another woman's bra.
It was mine. Yeah.
Right. So that's really interesting because usually if wives find a bra in their husband's luggage, it's not their bra.
Yeah, I would have never suspected cheating, really. I really trusted my husband so much. And I said, I remember before the doo-doo really hit the fan that I told one of my neighbors, my husband would never, cheat on me. He would, I just trust him completely.
Well, in
Well,
some ways, it's kind of sweet. I think about, maybe he wanted just something to remind himself of you. And so I could see that as being like something as if my husband were to do that, thinking, oh, how sweet.
yeah, I would have, that was the excuse that I was given. And I thought it was really weird because it was, like my pretty pink, satiny one. I thought, that's what you chose? I mean, I have big t-shirts. I have a teddy bear that I slept with still, mainly because I didn't like my legs to touch or my knees to touch at night. They would get red spots from touching. So I was like, you could have asked me for something, and so that so many things happened that were just dismissed early on, like some hair removal or some excess shaving that didn't need to happen that I didn't understand, like he shaved his legs. And he had mentioned, I want to shave my legs because he had so many reasons. He finally said it's bothering him at work because he had worked in the field, outdoors, and he said it was the jeans are pulling on his hairs. I never heard any such a thing from a man. So I just said, look, you are going to do what you want to do, but I'm not going to sleep in the same bed with you if you have prickly legs because your hair's growing out. And so
So
but
he had leg stubble because he wasn't shaving regularly.
right. Well, I mean, even with, I just women who shave regularly, I mean, I get prickly by the next day, and so that would be weird to me. It would remind me of, rubbing against my mom's legs when I was little, and so I'm just like, that is just a turnoff and would feel really wrong. And so I just warned him how that would be very uncomfortable for me. And I thought he would respect my feelings. So that was kind of one of the first biggest shocks that he did that. And we had been very close. And that resulted in me sleeping in another room because it was just creepy. I mean, I really wouldn't have characterized it as cross-dressing, and I'm not sure that I had that knew that term at that time. And then I found, and I was actually finishing my college up, and he was had started his career. So although we were married, we were living apart for a portion of the week. And when I came home on one weekend, I was using our joint computer and found pictures in the cache. Not sure how I clicked on that. I wasn't very computer savvy, so it was a complete accident. So who knows what I didn't ever see. And there were these pictures of these extremely ugly women that just weren't attractive, and they were just wearing very tacky lingerie as well. So I questioned him, why are you even looking at this? And he had, for everything, he had an answer. And it was, to comfort me. So the answer that time was, oh, those were just sent to me by this guy at work. And so I was like, okay. So I started to think there was a little something going on with him. Part of me thought, well, I'm not there, and men talk or whatever. They go to the titty bar, whatever. That's not what else to call it besides that. Sorry for the crude language, but so, and I didn't like that. I wasn't comfortable with him going to like strip clubs with these guys at lunch, and so that was a little source of conflict. I just started to see a side that I didn't really recognize from when we were dating, and we had a long courtship, over a year and a half. And so I just, I really trusted him, and I felt that going to a bar like that was out of place for him, and that he was doing it out of pressure. I believed him about the pictures. Many years later, I would find out about those pictures. He actually brought it up, just kind of pouring out some of the truth one day. He told me those were men. You know, that explains why the lingerie was tacky and why they weren't very attractive, because I was looking at that going, why are you even looking at this? Because, I was in my early 20s, looked better than those men for sure, and I had much better lingerie. So
So was he looking at them to get ideas, do you think, or to get validation, or was he sexually aroused by them, or
I
just
think
curiosity?
so. I didn't ask specifically that question of him, back when I was getting all kinds of honesty. I would say it's a little bit of both, ideas, as well as probably more ideas at that time. But there's definitely, from what I observed, a component of arousal, um, either from the idea of himself dressing that way, um, or maybe from seeing that. But he was very interested, I think, in how to get the look when he was alone.
Because I think one thing that a lot of people don't know about transgender, they sort of think of transgender as being, just one thing. But there are two very distinct kinds of transgender. And one is someone who has the gender dysphoria, who feels, it's a mental health issue. They have this disconnect with their body. And then there's another kind of transgender, which is the autogynephilic, who is actually sexually aroused at the idea of them being a woman. And it sounds like your husband was more on the side of autogynephilic than feeling like he was born in the wrong body.
That's what my opinion is. Of course, I'm not a professional on the subject, except for how much I've read. I can't diagnose somebody, but from what I know, that's how I would have characterized him. A long time ago, before I ever heard this AGP, there was another term that was originally used, and I think it was called autotransphilia. And then it's been so buried in the in the discussion of all this and in the original research, because that was on purpose. That was by design, from what I've read, because that would be too embarrassing. I mean, that's even more embarrassing than just cross-dressing. They wouldn't be able to push this whole narrative if it was in the category of a fetish, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's really different to say, my spirit doesn't feel at home in my body because I'm born in the wrong body. It elicits compassion. Whereas if someone says, yeah, I get sexually aroused when I pass as a woman, that's going to put red flags up for a lot of people. And I think that's why they've pushed the whole idea that trans women are women, that it's because they were born in the wrong body, it's not a mental health issue, because they want to normalize it so people have compassion for them. And of course, we want to have compassion for anybody who has a mental health issue. But in this case, it's a paraphilia. If they're getting, it's a turn on for them, and a way for them to get sexually aroused. So it's a very different kind of disorder than, say, other kind of mental health disorders, or even someone who's got gender dysphoria.
Right, and it's definitely changes the approach to trying to treat it.
Mm.
And I definitely have compassion for people who are sexually broken. But the first step in treating sexual brokenness is to recognize that it actually is sexual brokenness. And nowadays, we refer to sexual brokenness as sexual rights. And we don't really care whose lives are ruined in the process of, um, seeking those rights and exercising those so-called rights. Of course, we do have some autonomy over our bodies and what we do with them. However, I think we also commitment still means something. Family means something, and we need to be using our bodies in ways that are healthful, and not detrimental to our own selves. And unfortunately, the medical and psychological professions have been very enabling, and that's part of my story. I will say that, you know, transgender people, I can identify when I hear them say, "Look, nobody is hearing us, and nobody is, knows how we feel." And well, I I understand when someone says they're not heard, because as a person who I call myself a trans widow, I think no one even knows what we are. We're like a unicorn. We're not even supposed to exist. We're not allowed to have a voice. So if transgender feel, like no one's heard, when they have a tremendous lobby now, and they've influenced so much of the conversation with their victimhood narrative, then but no one's heard from the real victims of the women affected by this when their husbands leave, the parents whose children leave and join the cult and reject their parents. But the narrative is that the parents reject them, when in reality they're being pulled away. And the narrative is, anyone who doesn't understand this, after your months or years of planning it with your support from that community, suddenly we're supposed to just, eyes open and heart open to this whole change, which may not be healthy for you and has a big domino effect in the family. And also, and the female athletes are also a victim, and all females in all professions. When a man steps in and says he's a woman, he's breaking the glass ceiling. He's not doing it with the same lived experience as a woman at all, because many of us are the caretakers for our families as well as working. And when we do that, there's not a husband at home usually taking on all the family stuff. Maybe they share in chores, but they're not. We have two jobs. Even if we don't have children, we have parents. We're always the one considered the primary caregivers, whether it's children or parents. And we take care of the family. So, and
I'm
even
so
if,
glad that you mentioned that, because one of the things that I've heard from other trans widows like you um, is that when their husband decided to become transgender, he embraced all the makeup, the hair, the clothes, spent a lot of money to make himself pretty, but he didn't continue to do the things around the house that he had been doing as the husband or the father in the family. But he also didn't take on any responsibilities that would typically be considered a woman's role. And so it's almost like they abdicate all responsibility within the family, and just get to focus on themselves. And anybody who doesn't support and affirm that is considered transphobic. So it's like we're expected to embrace this what looks like pretty narcissistic behavior, and are criticized if we don't completely enable and support it. So I can't imagine how that must have felt for you to sort of be the caretaker of the family and then have your husband. Now, when we were talking, you said that he started to show these signs. Did he actually completely transition at some point?
He did right out. He started transitioning while we were still married, and legally transitioned on paper before divorce.
So
And
so he changed his like ID and such. So
mhm, yeah,
technically you became a lesbian according to
yeah, a paper
the
lesbian.
a
Yeah,
paper lesbian. A legal lesbian.
not only that, while we were married, early on in his or in our marriage, right after my first child, that's when I started to really think of what he was doing as cross dressing. And he had admitted it to me while our son was in the hospital that he cross dressed. And I was staying a week in the hospital with my son. He was really sick and almost died. And during that time, my then husband was cross dressing his butt off, golfing, having a good time, calling into work. We worked at the same place, and he was saying, "Oh, he's spending time, with the baby and helping me." He was not. He was not at the hospital. He was having a good time, which is narcissistic behavior. And but I was fine at the hospital with the baby. I loved taking care of the baby, not a problem. But that's when he decided to come clean. And it was around Halloween. And I think that a lot of women who've been married to men like this, find Halloween to be a really tough time because that's when they try to have an excuse to dress up. So he had kind of been pushing the envelope there with Halloween coming up, that what he wanted to dress like. And I was pushing back like that's like seems weird to me and in the realm of really feminine, don't understand what will people at work think, because we actually had a Halloween day at work and we're redressed up. So he finally admitted at the hospital that he had a problem in his youth with cross-dressing, and that he would dress up in his mother's lingerie or bras. And this was just something he said that relaxed him. So I didn't understand that. I felt there were many other ways to relax. And so I said, well, I don't want to be married to you if you're doing that. That's really creepy. I feel like it steals from our intimacy. When I found that he had been doing those things at times, it was hurting our own closeness. So we went to a counselor that he found, and I thought we were there to work on our marriage, but we were there to work on getting me to embrace his cross dressing, apparently. And I was told by the counselor, and this is the first time I really saw the teeth of that movement, of the transgender cult. This therapist told me that I should allow my husband to go cross dress with other men on like girls' nights out for the men, and he could have a PO box where he would get women's magazines and catalogs and invitations for cross-dressing outings and weekends, and I would never have to see any of it, so it shouldn't even bother me. And I said no.
Wow. That's really not a way to build intimacy within a relationship, is to allow someone to have a separate life.
It's
I
really
mean,
creepy.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's really I can't imagine how you would have felt to have a counselor tell you just to. I mean,
Yeah.
I could understand if the counselor tried to negotiate something like, well, he wants to do this. How about if you allow him to, once a week wear women's underwear, or, try to negotiate some kind of a compromise. But it sounds like you were just being told, you just have to accept this.
I I needed to find a way according to her, and he would be a better, more understanding uh, spouse according that that's what I get. And I'm going, but to start with, he doesn't understand how uncomfortable this makes and how it's hurting the intimacy here. Of course, I was blamed for that. I was blamed for being cold, like a cold fish, and I wasn't a cold fish, and I didn't have anything really to compare the relationship to. Um, I was accused of being a cold fish when I had a horrible yeast infection that I couldn't get rid of. Of course, you can't have intimacy when you're going through that. So everything was about him. I was starting to see how everything was about him, and my what was good for me was not mattering. And I think for a very long time I just accepted that. And this therapist that we didn't see for very long as a couple, actually told me that I was closed-minded because I wasn't open to allowing my husband to do these things behind my back. She recommended a book called My Husband Betty, which was written by a woman who had admittedly been a lesbian. And the whole thing was just about how they became girlfriends and would go have tea together, dressed up. And I mean, she even admitted that you lose your relationship to this new personality that's emerging. And that's not who I fell in love with. So if a new personality was going to emerge, that was going to be part time, or full time. I just knew it was going to take over because there was so much pressure about this. And if he really was feeling trapped in the wrong body, that's not what he was saying at the time. The therapist said at that time, well, he won't know if he's a male or a female for 3 months. And I said, if he doesn't know what he is, then I've got my answer. I don't need to be here. I'm going to file for divorce. And of course, she told me I was very closed minded because, I wasn't interested in him dressing up with these other men and a secret life. Then she told me that I'm probably a lesbian. You must be a lesbian because you fell in love with this man. He has this inner feminine side. It's just a good thing that I wasn't as vulnerable as he was because he listened to her. And even though we agreed we were not going back to her, he saw her behind my back for 11 more years.
Oh,
She,
wow.
yeah, she wrote him a letter. Um,
So she was
that
very much buying into this gender affirming
she was,
attitude.
she's one of them. She's in their
Yeah.
community. She's the one that if you go to the websites,
To get
that,
your translate. And it reminds me so much, what you're saying reminds me so much of Lynn Meager, whose children became trans, and she went to a therapist to get support and instead was told she was closed-minded. And it just is heartbreaking to me that someone in your position didn't get some support and potentially could save the marriage. I mean, I believe that if someone had given good advice and counseled your husband, potentially could have saved your marriage. I mean, I think that the problem with this movement is that those who don't support it are vilified, and those in it are just like, there's just this, cheerleaders on the sidelines urging, egging them, go further, go all the way, go all the way. And it's just exactly what you shouldn't do when somebody has those issues is to encourage them. And it also takes away that sense of self-autonomy when someone's told, oh, you can't help it, this is, the whole trans narrative is that there's nothing you can do about it, it's just the way you are. And we know that's not true. We know that people have autonomy and can make choices and change their beliefs and feelings if they really want to. And so that experience is just, I think you're not alone. But it's so heartbreaking to me that as a wife, you're told that you're in the wrong when your husband is essentially being completely dishonest with you.
right. And the reality is a person transitioning has to make several choices along that path. But we're told they have no choice. Well, there's several choices and that they make. And as far as what transitioning procedures they're going to have and how they're going to live their life. So they do make choices. So to say they're without choices and power, it's just a lie. But we see this lie across all of our society now. We're children are told, basically you have no power. You're, if you don't fit this category of people, Christian, white, and cisgender, male, then you're at a distinct disadvantage in the world. So I think this is just a very evil narrative that is robbing people of their personal power and choice, across all types of disciplines and teachings. It's not right, it's not fair, and it's robbing us of real clarity on how to move forward in our own lives.
And it's actually the opposite of everything. I've studied psychology. They talk about having a locus of control, and people who have an internal locus of control are more successful, they're happier, they're more motivated because they have a sense that they can change. Whereas people who are told that they can't change and that they're just, subject to the whims of whatever the world hits them with, they are vulnerable and they struggle. So it's a really dangerous narrative, especially to teach to our kids, which
Right.
makes me wonder, how did you have a son? Do you have more than one child?
I have 3 children with my first husband.
And how do they negotiate this? Are they do they have contact with him? Do they accept the narrative that he is a woman?
Okay, so yes, they have contact. That's been something that had to be renegotiated over time due to issues with his a prior um, love interest of his that was abusive to my children.
Mhm.
So, as well as just some not good decisions on his part. So we modified the custody arrangement. He was very close to have losing custody, but we went for a settlement agreement because really, when you sever um, visitation and all of that, it's usually rather temporary. There's hoops, and I felt I wanted something where we didn't have to go into court again, and I could maintain the really important pieces of that settlement, which were psychiatric, psychological, medical care for my own children, that I make the decisions. So um, I'm the one that has the decision making, for the children, as well as most of the time with the children. And he gets visitation, so he does get to see his children. I wasn't ever going to deny him to see his kids, but as if I could do things over, I would like that they had more power. Just feeling out of control is something kids experience in divorce anyway. But with all they were subjected to, that they shouldn't have been subjected to, they should have had some power where they weren't going back and forth and into an environment where there was abuse that required going through the slow process of going to court. And when I was a single mom, I didn't have much money to even, file a motion to follow the order that we had in place. So, and I really didn't want to push the button and cause like all the dominoes to fall and have the whole LGBTQ backing him, which happened to me twice. I mean, it was $100,000 in attorney's fees because you're not just going to a regular battle or a simple motion for enforcement when you're battling someone who's got narcissistic tendencies and the LGBTQ behind them trying to score some type of political points with their children as their pawns. So that was we had the first case of a trans parent being awarded joint custody in our state. It might have even been nationwide, but it was a milestone for their movement. And
I
they
hadn't even thought of how that would affect, here in my naive little world, I'm thinking that you guys are negotiating this the way everybody else does. And then as soon as you said that, I'm thinking of all the force of the LGBT activists and how much money and power and how really they're willing to bully people. And I just can't imagine how, on top of like a divorce, having to, it's like you're not just negotiating the divorce with him, you're negotiating it with the LGBT activists, and they have their agenda that they want to get passed. And that must, and then your kids are also involved, which it always, I always get very upset when kids are dragged into this because it's confusing. Divorce is hard enough. And then to add that extra layer, it just, it's so damaging to these kids.
So it's not really real at the time when it's happening. It didn't feel real to me. I think I told everyone I met, oh, my husband, I'm getting a divorce. My husband is transitioning to be a woman. Yeah. And because I just didn't even believe it, I had to say it out loud. So if it was that hard for me as an adult to understand, imagine how hard it is for kids. And they would cry at school and put their heads down on their desks because there would be something announced that was going to be with dads invited to do a special occasion at school, maybe dad and daughters or dad and sons. And I have one daughter with him and 2 sons with him. They just spanned ages across, at the time we divorced, they were 5, 6, and 10. So they, they would cry, but they wouldn't share with me that they had been sad because they didn't want to put more on me, because as much as I thought they weren't seeing, my side of things, they did see that I was in a great deal of pain. I did go through a really tough time as a woman. And I lost my marriage, which I really wasn't that happy in, but with my husband. But I was really happy and in a good place with my domestic life, with my children. I loved being home with them. I had been a stay at home mom for 10 years with them. So it was really difficult to go through, and the kids saw that, and they didn't want to add to my pain by sharing what they were going through. And of course, that just made my, the whole thing worse when I found out, oh, you didn't feel like you could talk to me. How
And how
horrible.
confusing for kids to suddenly be told that their dad is actually a woman. I mean, that's just that's really emotional manipulative behavior, and it's got to. I mean, kids know that's not true, and yet they're being told by society, by perhaps your husband, by activists that it is true, and that's really not fair to do to kids. It's I could understand if somebody wanted to live in that lifestyle and they told their kids, yes, I'm a transsexual, so I'm a man who likes to dress up and pretend to be a woman. But to tell kids that they actually are a woman, which is the new narrative. I'm not sure if that's the narrative your kids got, but
It is. It is. They were mandated into court ordered psychological, counseling. And while there, they were told they could no longer call their father dad.
this is
And
in court counseling.
yeah, this was mandated by the court. I could not choose their counselor. This is, and I could not change their counselor. I had to go back to court. That was one of the reasons for getting the modification of the order later, because I was driving my kids 35 miles back and forth, 35 miles one way to go see this court appointed psychologist. And most of the time she wasn't even available because she worked for the court. So she had all kinds of emergency stuff come up. So I finally, as part of our modification, said this is, she was okay in many ways, although that part in the beginning, she was being really PC until she saw how much damage all this was doing. Because I think this was pretty new to her. I think she had only had one other case, and it did not involve children. So she was just kind of following the narrative and how that profession kind of has gotten very corrupted by the influence of the movement. So
So
um,
they actually um, do they still refer to your husband as mom or
no. In fact, that whole mom thing, when they came home to me and said, that their dad tried to tell them that he's their mom, they were not comfortable with that. I said, really, we can't change what your dad's doing. In as much as we don't like it, there's only some things we can do. So, but you have some, boundaries that you can put in place without being disrespectful. Unfortunately, a lot of people want to say if you don't use their pronouns or go right along, that this is disrespectful and mean and hurtful, and they're going to jump off a building or some kind of stuff. Well, I firmly believe that we can have, our own beliefs, and that we need to find boundaries in all relationships that are healthy have some boundaries. And so I just told them, for me, um, that is always going to be your father. And it's very insulting to me if you call him your mother, especially since he made being the mother, much more burdensome than beautiful by the things that he did. And as beautiful as being their mother is, he did everything to destroy, all the things that were beautiful in life. That's how I felt at the time. So I just told them it's not to be affirming that if that's not what felt right for them. And so they did not want to use the new name that the therapist came up with. It was some kind of word like Anya. It's like I don't know, German word maybe, for aunt or something. And, they were trying to navigate, well, what do I tell my friends about this
Yeah.
strange looking woman? Or they could tell that it was their dad, but he's looking more feminine. Or, what do they say to their friends at school? So, they lie to people. They're like, well, that's my mom's friend, and, or that's our aunt. And if a parent was confused, and whenever he finally started passing a little better, which he doesn't pass very well, but people actually thought that was just an ugly woman and a friend of mine, because he would come to the kids' events, and they would ask me, who is that? And I felt it was a violation to even tell the truth, because I mean, I don't want to cover for him. I also don't want to out him. And I don't want to embarrass the children, because this might get talked about in front of their friends. Who knows what their friends would hear from the parents.
It's
So it's
just,
like,
you're in such a no-win situation with that.
yeah, I
And,
mean, I'm not going to say, oh, that's my ex-husband, right? I don't want to do that. So,
and
because
I'm sitting here thinking, like, my mom radar goes up, just as you're talking about that. And I'm thinking how I would feel if I sent my daughter over to somebody's house thinking that they were going over to stay with a friend and the mom. And I found out later that it was actually a man. I would be incensed. I mean, and that's where I feel like this movement is so, it's so based on deception and lies. And if, I think if a friend of my kids had a parent who was openly transsexual and said, I'm a transsexual, I would feel much more comfortable about my kids going over to that house than I would if they were friends with a parent who said, I'm a woman, when in fact they're a man. Is because of this deception that is, and you're not, like you said, you're not allowed to out them, which means you're not allowed to talk reality. You're not allowed to speak truth. And I understand that you're trying to navigate all these different, your kids, your ex-husband, social expectations, and I just can't imagine how confusing that must have been.
oh, well, it's very difficult. Of course, there are the people who think the thing to say when you're like, reveal, well, I'm divorced, the kid's dad is transgender. The thing for them, their response, and I get this a lot, oh, well, at least he can be happy now. I mean, you wouldn't say that if my husband left me and the kids for, younger, hotter edition. So why is it okay to say that when they leave to transition? It's still morally wrong. It's still abdicating their duties as a father and a husband. So it's very difficult. Of course, when we went to court, there was another time when I saw the teeth of this movement, and how actually from the time of going to the therapist to how many years later was it, to like 11 years later when we finally did divorce, and when I went to court, they were trying to get me to use the pronouns, force, and because he had already changed his legal marker on his on identity ID and everything, so, and got a new name, and it was really unfair to try to push that in court, because I never refer to him in the new name and in the new print. I still don't. So I know how
And
he
you
lives.
shouldn't legally be compelled to. This is a very fundamental freedom of speech. Not to mention, somebody shouldn't be compelled to lie.
Right. And I can't erase my experience with him. He was the father of three of my children. For a while there, we had a nice marriage together, and we had some good memories and some good times. Definitely, it looked like the ideal marriage from the outside, and we had a Cape Cod house with a white picket fence, and the three kids. So it's not fair to make somebody, participate in someone else's, I guess, fantasy or mental issue that they have going on, and it's his identity. And so when it comes to myself and the kids, and you know it's something we each have had to learn on our own, because I try to give the kids the freedom to make their own choices, but with honest information, not indoctrination. Like, one of my kids told me, Mom, you've always given me the choice of how to think about these things, but you've shown me the different perspectives. And they've made their choice, and it is that they recognize him as their father, and they will be the ones affirming that that's who he is. They don't do that in an argumentative, confrontational way. They don't out him in public. They wouldn't do that. They do call him dad now. It took a while, and I think stumbling over, what to call him and pronouns to use. But they usually, when they're with them, it's in private, so they just they don't have anybody there like they used to have when they had the abusive activist, human rights campaign,
Yeah.
person in his life. So they, say dad, and in public they just will avoid pronouns, because that way they don't feel like they're violating their own conscience, and they're not going to bring harm. Now, the relationships, I'd say, are as good as they can be considering the history. One son is not interested in maintaining much contact. Um, they've met for lunch, I think, a couple times. Another son, who is almost 18, really is less interested in spending time, but does want to maintain some type of relationship. And the whole, going forward, I do have a grandchild, and the son that has a child is not interested in his dad knowing his own grandson, because he knows just how painful and confusing all that is. So that probably won't be happening for them. And then none of them really want him like at their weddings or any of those, really deeply involved. But a peripheral relationship, contact, I care about you, you're still my father. They want that, but he has been absent in the main ways that you would just think of a father. Now he doesn't think so. He thinks he has really great conversations and influence. The reality is, even when we have good conversations about the kids, about their academics, or what's going on with them emotionally, because there has been a lot, especially in regards to what he's done, and just once a family's in crisis. So the things I've done, the way I handled all of that and how it affected me, moving forward in all my relationships, with the kids and my own husband, as I'm remarried. So yeah, once a family is in crisis, it's a very hard to come out of it. And we don't have the kind of support that, like families of alcoholics have. There's no program designed around our trauma and understanding how it affects every kid. But I will say, I did see every kid step through, and I've got one kind of in the midst of it right now, this very trauma centered area in their teens, which some people are like, all teens go through that. No, they don't go through all this. I mean, this is a little different, where they've been suppressing the grief because kids don't know how to process this type of grief. It is like a loss, it's like a death, but you can't process it like a death because this person is still present and saying, I'm still the same person, I just look different, and I'm just happier now. Never mind all the, how it's hurting you. Never mind, because I'm like a butterfly. I went through metamorphosis. This is how it's explained to the kids, like a butterfly going through metamorphosis. And, like, okay, if we're talking about a really creepy lying butterfly, because it just is, how do you have moral authority when you're basically showing your kids how to con people and lie?
And that's one of the things that really worries me about children in this situation, is the messages they're getting about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And oftentimes the message that they're getting is that what it means to be a woman is to wear makeup and dresses. And those of us who are women know that that's not true. That's not what makes us women. And seeing men appropriate womanhood, I've heard it described as very similar to in minstrel shows when white people would put blackface on, that men are putting on woman face because they think they know what it's like to be a woman, but they don't. and the message that they're giving to their children is that this is what it means to be a male, this is what it means to be a female. I've just, now I'm a female. And I think that that's really unhealthy because, well, first of all, from my perspective, I think that it's important for kids to know that they don't have to be gender conforming, that it's okay to, to be a little bit outside of those lines of the typical stereotypes of what it means to be male or female. But now this narrative is suggesting that those very stereotypical things are what define us as male and female. So it's sort of, it's got to be really confusing to kids who are already grappling with so much, to then also have this parent who is gone but still here, and that is happy, and if you don't affirm them, then somehow you're violating their happiness, and that parent's happiness is somehow more important than you having your father. I mean, that's a lot to unpack for a kid.
Yeah, I mean, the happiness thing is a big deal. You know, when the kids have went to him in the past with to have conversations about how this is impacting them, um, or how they feel hurt, because there were different points as they got older that they wanted to have the conversation with him, get some things off their chest, clear the air for their own benefit. And unfortunately, I'm glad they did get some stuff off their chest, because I do think in some ways it helped, but it also caused another wave of grief. You know, the whole having to acknowledge that this person really will never hear me, because narcissism is a big deal, very consistent, you know, throughout all the stories that I know of other women and that have gone through this. And they're just, you know, always turn the tables back to themselves. But what about me? And I'm so hurt. And you know, just this is an adult that starts crying, you know, and the right thing to do, like I tell my kids, look, you can't come and be disrespectful. You can't come and just tell me off. If you feel I've done something and that I need to be hearing from you, you know, your feelings, and you know, let's make an appointment outside of an emotional time where we can talk, where you can listen, and I maybe don't say anything, you know, that time. And then we can have another time where I'm able to talk to you without a reaction, you know, without all that, you know, feeling, you know, like just reacting. You know, let me process that. But to just, you know, be manipulated, like, oh, well, now I'm crying because you told me that I hurt you somehow, but what about me? And it's all your mother's fault. I mean, it was actually my fault for leaving. You know, that's what the kids were told. If I had just stayed, he wouldn't have done all this. But when in reality, the hormones were hidden around my house. You know, he was behind my back talking to people at the then transgender center. That's not in existence now. It's become something else. But you know, making all these new transgender friends, and you know, that's one of the things I think people need to understand about the whole cult of transgenderism, and sexual brokenness in general. There are the three A's: affirmation, affection, and attention. And they get all that over in that community and with the activists and the new friends they make. And so whether it's your teenager or your husband or your brother, your sister, cousin, whatever, that those are the hooks, you know, no matter what we're talking about under the LGBTQ rainbow, those are your hooks for sexual brokenness and this identity movement that they're having. So maybe they didn't get some of that at home, you know, or they felt they didn't, you know, sometimes for
Well, there are
certain.
so many people who are just, they're broken.
Yeah.
All of us have need for affirmation, for affection. That's as human nature. And especially I think during the teen years, that's really common. And so if you find a group that's willing to, give you that attention, affirmation, and affection, it's really hard to walk away from that. It's very seductive, which is one of the reasons why why the cult is so powerful. And then to top it all off with, we have the them versus us. So it's like, we're protecting you, we love you, and then they vilify anybody who doesn't do that. So it's a very compelling group, and I understand why so many people are pulled into it. And I
And
think that
Yeah.
that for
That's a
kids to
cool step.
understand that's and I mean, I'm so glad that you understand that you haven't taken on that responsibility that they're trying to place on you to say that this is your fault, which is just absurd. And it seems like you have such clarity, which I think is really impressive.
No, I fought for my marriage, and he had several chances, and I would have been willing to forgive and put it all behind us if he just would have been the man that God ordained him to be. That this does work as a cult. We don't just call it a cult because we don't like them or something. It is cult behavior. When someone tries to leave that uh, culture, they are vilified.
Hmm.
They are treated as if they don't exist, like unicorns. Like my friend Kevin Witt, who is a former transgender, former drag queen, formerly gay, and now is living as a straight man and a Christian. So they just vilify him. They continue to say he's homosexual. They continue to say he's not being true to himself. They're treated horribly. And that's what cults do. When you try to leave, they treat you horribly. So that's not love. We're told this is all about love. That's not love. You know, I just don't understand how they've been so effective at deceiving people
It's
with the stuff they
confusing because it
have.
reminds me of like an alcoholic going to an AA meeting and being encouraged to hide alcohol around the house and being told that they don't have to be responsible for any bad behavior they have when they're drinking and that their families should accept them as alcoholics. It's
Yeah.
kind of what it reminds me of because the behavior they're engaging in is harmful not just to them but to their family, and it's sort of releasing them of any responsibility that they have, which, like you said, is a very cult-like mentality. And I think it's funny that you mentioned Kevin being told that he's still gay, because I have transgender people tell me that I've internalized my trans identity, and that if I would just accept that I'm transgender and live as such, that I would be so much happier. And I mean, it's the manipulation of the language, and then the whole suicide thing on top of that, that if you don't accept people, that you're responsible for their death if they become suicidal. It's all, like you said, it's not that labeling it a cult is being is trying to call it a name. We're using like the definition of cult behavior, and that's what's happening in the transgender movement right now.
Right. And, as a trans widow, there's just several fronts where trans widows are not being considered. I mean, on the legal front, in the family court front, we're not being considered. Just like female athletes, finally you're getting some recognition. Trans widows need recognition. There needs to be a pause button. When you're married to somebody, you shouldn't be able to pursue chemical transition and legal transition without the full knowledge and consent of your spouse. That seems only right.
It's funny that you say that, because my husband had a vasectomy a number of years ago, and the doctor would not perform the vasectomy without me written consent. And they had to watch me do it. It was, and so if a man can't get a vasectomy without his wife's permission, it seems like at the very least, maybe not consent, but at least telling you that this is happening, because it has such a huge impact. So the fact that anybody can go behind their spouse's back and get these kind of treatments, it could potentially put you in harm's way, really, if there are hormones floating around the house.
Or really, it can. And in my case, maybe it did. I just won't medically know. I did get uterine cancer from a pregnancy that I miscarried. I didn't understand at the time why he was saying it was his fault and he felt he did something. But in
Wow.
my I discovered several messages between him and another woman that accepted his whole cross dressing and was helping him with transition. He actually said in those messages, and this may not be medically accurate, but maybe it played a role. He said that he was afraid that his taking hormones had affected his semen, which caused me to have the type of pregnancy where I miscarried. I miscarried twins with a molar pregnancy. I don't understand what causes molar pregnancy, but something is wrong with the fertilization. And he thought maybe, it was on his end because it did affect his fertility, and it did affect his ability, to be sexually intimate. And that was something that I definitely did notice in our marriage, that, there had been a slump, at times in the sex life. So it didn't necessarily really bother me because I was so focused on our children. That became my real focus. And did I wonder if it was normal? Yeah. Did I think, am I not pretty enough? What is it? And, I did lots of things to try to spice things up, buy new lingerie, just try to show interest. I mean, I think it was like a week ago, he called me and said he found a letter from me, or he just received. The way he phrased it is, I received a letter from you today. And I was like, where did that come from? Because I didn't send a letter. And um, we get along okay. That all the past is a long way in the past now, and we're not best friends. Not going to go have tea and shop for girl clothes together. But he called to say he had found this letter. It was a love note. I put in his flight bag because he does flight lessons, and I guess he picked those up again recently and opened that bag, and there was a letter, and it said, "This is like I must have done a series of letters trying to." One of my attempts to try to strengthen our relationship, because it had just been so battered by the whole cross-dressing thing. And I always was fighting for our relationship. And I think by the end of it, I was just exhausted, trying to do everything on my end, and that not being really reciprocated with, with him giving up the thing that was really damaging the relationship. I mean, were there other problems? Probably, yeah, but like normal ones, that we could walk out as a couple and both learn from. But this was something that, when you have something that's secretive, it's different. You're being gaslighted, something's wrong, but you're told it's not what you think it is. It's not what you see. It's something else. And that's gaslighting. You're made to feel crazy. You get angry, and then you're being called crazy because you got angry. It's just really was a tough time. I don't remember a lot of it because it was such a tough time, but I do remember the highlights of that. I know women who are trans widows are in a very tough spot without a lot of support. With no support, one front's illegal, the other is in the in the churches. They're not speaking to this issue and how heartbreaking it is, how it's wrecking families. They have no response for the heart. They have no. It was really, it cut me away from churches, and it still is a real turnoff when I'm encountering pastors that do not know how to speak truth to this issue, do not know to speak compassionately to those who are in that, because they need to know, because this is a lot of our children nowadays, how to say, I'm sorry that you are experiencing this confusion. How long has this been going on? How long have you felt this way about yourself? And what can I do to help? Let me point you to what the Bible says about your identity, because I come to this from the Christian perspective. But to be not even speaking to that in our churches.
Well, and psychologists as well, because
Right.
psychologists, I mean, if you look through the DSM-5, which is the psychological manual, um, there's no other case where therapists, counselors are encouraged to embrace and reinforce and affirm delusional thinking. And delusional, again, it's not meant to be disrespectful. It's a medical term. They believe something that's not true. And so it's not just in the clergy, it's in the, in the secular world as well, when we have doctors and therapists who are um, unwilling to speak truth about this. And I've talked to some therapists about this, and they're afraid. They say that they wish they could speak out about it, but they're afraid that, like you said, the LGBTQ um, activists have such strong teeth, and they will go after people who challenge it. And so, the people, it's so ironic to me that the movement is suggesting that they're marginalized and they're victims and they're oppressed, when from my perspective, they're the ones who are being the bullies. They're the ones who are trying to control speech. They're the ones who are gaslighting people. They're the ones with the power. They're the ones who are dictating how they're going to be treated. And I'm sure that in their minds they're feeling picked on, but again, that's part of the delusion, and that's part of what society needs to push back on a little bit. And it can be done compassionately. I feel my heart goes out to these people, because I can't imagine what it would be like to be so convinced that you have to be something that you're not, and that you are having to rely on these other people for affirmation, affection, and attention, because you have to sell your soul really to get that. I mean, they're not filling you up and healing you. These people, these
They're
communities are
killing
not.
them. They are actually killing them.
Right.
The very people who really love and care about those who either have confusion or a fetish, or but ultimately buy into the idea they need to change their sex and go through all these procedures and take all the hormones, are the people who are their families, who love them, and we're being told to love and support them looks, one way, looks like destroying their bodies, mutilating them, putting on the path of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex for the rest of their lives, making them believe that if they don't do this, they're going to die. So what happens when they realize that this transition stuff doesn't work like they've been told it works? Well, they're going to kill themselves, and so we don't want anyone, to kill themselves, whether we agree with them or not. That's a really sad outcome, which you can't change. There's no correcting anything once you get to that finality. So that's not what we want at all. And we're the ones who care the most. Like I
Yeah, when
certainly.
your family, when the ones who love you and care about you, and that's something I tell my son sometimes. He's 16, and sometimes he gets mad at me because I'm a mom. And I'll say, I want you to know I'm always on your side. I'm always on your side. I always want your success. I always want you to be happy and healthy. And that's my goal as a mom. And I think that's something that it makes me so sad. These kids are taught to reject their parents who love them. And in this case, the husband is rejecting the wife who loves him. You reject people who love you because they're not willing to affirm this harmful thought process. And based on what Walt Heyer has said, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he went through the whole sex change and then realized, he went through all of this and it didn't help. He still had these feelings. And I believe that a lot of people are stifling those feelings by surrounding themselves with these groups that are affirming them. But at some point, the truth is going to hit that they've done all this and they still feel that emptiness. They're still broken. And now they've lost the people who truly love them, and they've damaged their bodies. And as the study in Sweden has shown of the long-term outcomes of this, that the suicidality goes way up 5, 10, 15 years down the road, because these people realize they've lost the people who love them, they've damaged their bodies, and they've surrounded themselves by people who don't have their best self-interest at heart.
But they probably replace the people that really love and care about them and that have the really deep roots with them with some shallow friendships that affirm and validate their behavior and their thinking, rather than keep people around. And most people don't want to sever the relationships. It may be too painful to walk those relationships out in the way that they would have, had they not transitioned. And a lot of that is the abusive nature of telling somebody that they must affirm your pronouns and do all and tolerate you coming to family gatherings all decked out as a woman now, or if it's a female going to male, whatever. But boundaries are important in relationships, and I think everyone should learn that. And it doesn't mean you hate somebody. You're what's not considered by the other side of this debate is that the people who love you are experiencing grief, and they're given no time. They're given no time to experience that grief. It's you've got to accept this right now, or you don't love me, because that's what they're told by the cult.
Mm. And I'll go
Um,
find people who love me if you won't.
right, you got to love me the way I say you got to love me. We know that doesn't work in marriages, right? You don't, you know, marry somebody and think they're going to change. Like, well, you've got to be more romantic. You've got to do these things. You've got to love, do what I say, or else you don't love me. That's you've got to violate your conscience. You've got to believe something that isn't true in order to love me. These are false narratives. It doesn't work. It's not how relationships work. And unfortunately, the people who they probably need the most are pushed away mostly by them. And I encourage people to stay involved with the person that is, going through this transition.
If they'll let you, if they'll let
If
you.
they'll
And
let you.
that's the hard part, is so often they're told, if you're not 100% affirmed by someone, then they don't love you and you should have nothing to do with them. Again, very cult like behavior.
Right. And I think that we have to switch, kind of be the ones to switch the table around and say, well, do you not love me? If
Yes.
you're not accepting my reality, does that mean you don't love me? I mean, I would assume that the child or the parent is there because they're saying because they do love the parent and they do want a relationship, or otherwise this is just posturing. This is a power play, and that's not loving at all. And that may be and in the case of children, we see that all the time. They're not really developed emotionally, and so it is a lot about them. But um, that's not a loving position. You must love me this way. You must believe these things. You must reflect. That's narcissism. You must reflect what I want you to reflect. As soon as you don't reflect the image of myself that I want you to reflect, I no longer have use for you. That's being used as a narcissistic source of, and they're using up your energy.
Yeah,
You
because
know,
I think that's, the interesting thing is that you can love someone deeply, even if you don't approve of their behavior. And I think of that in so many cases. If I affirmed and approved everything that my kids wanted me to, they would be a disaster. I would be a disaster. The house would be, I mean,
just
part of
even trying to
parenting is,
be bossy all the time.
yeah.
Just they're not the best version of ourselves. I mean, I know in my marriage I've been told sometimes, well, about my attitude, or I tell the kids all the time about theirs. They tell me. So there is some correction that goes on in relationships. There's boundary making, but when you take away reality, where are the boundaries? Where are you going to draw them?
Well, and at
So
what point is it, I mean, how far can someone go in a relationship like this and claim it's because of their authentic self? So, at what point, if someone comes home and says, honey, I'm really a woman, your husband says really a woman, and this didn't happen in his case, but what if he says, and I'm actually really a 5-year-old, and so I'm going to start interacting with their kids as if I'm their playmate rather than their father. I mean, at what point why is it this particular little thing we're supposed to affirm, and how far is it going to go? And that's always what I think of, sort of the long-term implications. If we accept that someone can change their sex on their birth certificate, why can't they change their age? Why can't they change where they were born? Why can't they change their parents? All of these things that are, uh, they're facts. And if we are not going to accept basic biological facts, then what do we accept, and who gets to decide that? And why is it that they get to decide it and we don't? Why is it that their reality we need to validate their reality, but they don't have to validate our reality?
well, they shouldn't be able to change historical documents. These
Right.
are important records. It's important for medical purposes. It's important for legal purposes. And just as a mother who's registered her kids for many things, been to many doctor appointments, and had to deal with documenting who are the parents, and then facing these conflicting documents. Oh, there's different last names, there's different, wait a minute, the father is this person with a female name, or this isn't a matter of let's change all the forms. Okay, we don't need to change all the forms to accommodate one group of people. Let's just stick with what the truth is. And if you want to pretend that you're something you're not, that's your identity
Mm-hmm.
issue. That's your burden to carry. That's not society's burden. That's the same thing my children say. It's not my identity issue. That is my dad's identity issue. I don't need any special story read to me to make me understand it, help me respect or love my father anymore. It doesn't make me love him less, but I don't need all of society to bend to this. That's not what they want. Did it hurt whenever they, didn't have a dad to bring to the father son event? Did it hurt when they didn't have a dad to bring to the father daughter event? Yeah, it hurt. They don't want everyone else to have their family deconstructed. They don't want, sex to be deconstructed. And that's not how you fix this. Putting this on everyone else. I mean, I think that is the very definition of oppressing. Because you're oppressing the truth of biology for one thing, and you're not letting all of us exercise our own conscience. So that is oppression.
It
So if
is.
you want to know who's being oppressed, it's the rest of us by this tiny group of people who say they're marginalized. Well, we haven't really heard from the mothers of transitioning kids much. We haven't heard from the wives who've been left, by this and how they're affected, because this is uncharted territory. So you don't really have like family court laws that address this issue. Like, here's a man who's saying he's a woman, and he's like, well, I want all the rights of a father because I'm the father, so I have all the rights. But at the same time, like, I'm a woman and I want all the rights.
Well,
So
it really takes away, if your husband is saying he's their mom, then it almost usurps your role as the mother. And so it's all this, again, bending to what they want. And typically it's funny because my older boy went through a period where he was kind of angry with the system and sort of rebellious, and he grew his hair long and he dressed in a certain way that drew the attention of the police. And he would come home and he'd be, "Arr, arr, arr," and I'm like, honey, you're putting something out there and people are responding to it. And you have a choice. If you want to keep, putting it out there, that's fine. You can do that, but this is how people are going to respond to you. Women might back up from you. Police might look a little closer at you because of the way you're putting it out there. And that's, we shouldn't expect everybody in society to change just because you don't like how they're treating you. That's kind of how our society works, is that, we have social norms, and those social norms help us to negotiate relationships. And if we start saying that none of those social norms should be respected, anything goes, then it's the vulnerable, the true vulnerable people are the ones who are going to suffer the most. The mothers, the women, the children who aren't able to stand up for themselves, who have their roles taken over. I mean, in your case, your role as a mother was sort of undermined by a father saying he was actually the mother.
I mean, when I was pregnant or with one of the babies, he tried to, or he made a pregnancy belly complete with big old water balloon boobies, and wore that around like that was to help to understand my experience. But really, to me, I was like, I don't think you're going to understand my experience. And also, I'm experiencing a lot of issues seeing you dressing as a woman, basically going around the house doing chores. Like, I'm doing this, but I'm helping you do all these chores. So you just relax. And no, I can't relax. I'd rather do all this myself with my big giant belly and, just feeling awful in my swollen feet than to see you wearing, water balloon boobs. It's a turn off. It's more important to be, feeling good about who my husband is. This was really creepy. Like, I'm afraid someone's going to ring the doorbell. And then when that child was born, he wanted to breastfeed the baby, and I was getting this pressure about men can breastfeed. Men can breastfeed. I said, no, they cannot. And I really didn't think we were serious about this until he sent an article. It was like how men were lactating in some third world country. I'm like, I don't know what that has to do with us. We've got, I'm making plenty of milk.
Well, and you mentioned the concern about hormones. I
Yeah,
mean, that's concerning to me. We know what
yeah,
hormones are powerful, and that
yeah.
could really harm the child.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that he never tried to breastfeed the baby, without my knowledge. I
You
would That's disgusting if you and your hairy nipples, because he did actually keep his nipple hair, I think, at the
And
time.
so you'll never know though,
Oh, I'll
because he
never know.
wasn't honest with you. And
Been done when I
that's
was
part of the
there.
crux of this is that there's a basic breakdown of honesty, which I think is really what is the most dangerous here is that we're no longer being honest and truthful, and that's so harmful to families and to communities. And so we need to finish this up. I was wondering, is there anything, any last things that you want to share that you haven't had a chance to talk about?
No, not really. I think we've covered a lot of bases. I just, really hope that other trans widows will speak up, go to their state legislatures and maybe to the federal government. We need documents. To me, that's a big thing. We need a pause button for transitions. Women shouldn't have to go to court and be forced, as we're seeing more and more now, to use pronouns that affirm their soon-to-be ex-husband's new identity. That's bullying and should not be something that's done with the full force of the government. There needs to be a pause button when women are or men are married to someone who's transitioning. They should have to have at least the proof that we have the knowledge of it. Consent might be something that we can accomplish, but we should have the knowledge, because we have choices to make. We have to learn some things if someone you're married to is transitioning and on hormones and all that entails. And it entails a lot more than what we've spoken about here, because there's so much more to that community and all the sexuality of it, and how that would affect an intimate relationship and put it at risk. So I don't I think there's a lot that needs to be done. We're seeing a lot of lobbying and activism for the transgender, but we're not seeing enough to protect children or to protect women. And I really hope trans widows will unite, and people who are like-minded and will rise up and protect women and children. And we just saw a huge rally in Brooklyn yesterday for Black Trans Lives Matter. Every life does in fact matter, including the Black trans lives. I have no issue with that. My issue is that, what about all the children? And what about women who there are 22 transgender total in the United States killed last year. There are hundreds of thousands of children sexually abused, women abused, and we are changing laws and enabling people to be abusive. We are actually taxpayer funding the grooming of children now, and women are losing their rights and their protection, for bodily autonomy in private female spaces. And we must rise up. We've got to be as loud as they are. So let's use our experiences and our voice, because that's what's worked for the other side. They share their experience. There's some emotion. People don't agree with someone being disrespected just for living their life how they want to live it. Even as someone who's been a victim of all this, I don't think anyone should be treated in a shabby way, hurt, maligned. However, we must not infringe upon women's rights, and we must protect children. So, like I said, boundaries are important in relationships. They're also important for our society. And it's going to have to fall on us women and the good men of this country to rise up and not be afraid of being maligned, by the political correctness group and the transgender lobby, or as I call them sometimes, the KGBT, because they act like the KGB.
Yeah, they're bullies, and that's something I'm really thankful that you are telling your story. I know it's really a difficult story to tell, and you have to really be vulnerable. And one of the things that I've noticed is that stories like yours and stories like mine are being dismissed and ignored, often by the media, by the activists. And so we just have to keep telling our stories. We just have to keep letting people know how dangerous and damaging this narrative is. So I thank you so much for being willing to talk to me, and for all the efforts that you're doing to stand up for women's rights, for children's rights, and for the right to speak truth and honesty.